The South, Slavery, and African American Culture, Part 1. This week's reading is to read the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, Frederick Douglass's autobiography. I'd like you to start reading with the actual document itself. Please begin reading on page 47 in the Penguin edition, which is the edition that I assigned to the class, but begin reading with chapter 1. And then read to the end of the book, including the appendix. Now, let me do a dramatic reenactment, or perhaps I should say a pre-enactment of your beginning to read chapter 1. Quote, I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsborough, and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. So of course you're going to stop right there and you're going to get a map of Maryland to see what he's talking about. Well, let me save you a step. Here's a map of Maryland. At the bottom left you can see Washington, D.C. If you go straight east across Chesapeake Bay, you'll see St. Michael's, Easton, and Talbot County, where Frederick Douglass lived when he was on the plantation. In the book, Frederick Douglass makes several trips by water to Baltimore and spends a lot of time in Baltimore. And so you can see going to Baltimore would be a sea voyage across Chesapeake Bay of maybe 40 miles, something like that. So that should orient you geographically for reading Frederick Douglass's autobiography. All right, on to slavery. In the early 19th century in America, you have the rise of what has been called Southern exceptionalism. By Southern exceptionalism is meant that the South is different, or even backwards compared to the rest of the nation. And it's true. If you study the 19th century South, the South was less urban than the rest of the nation, less industrial, less economically developed, less educated, less middle class. It's like the South was Rip Van Winkle, fell asleep for 20 years, and then woke up 20 years behind the rest of the nation. Rip Van Winkle, the classic story by Washington Irving about this guy who falls asleep for 20 years and then wakes up 20 years behind everybody else. That's sort of what the South was like in the 19th century. The main reason for Southern exceptionalism is, of course, the institution of slavery. Now, historians once claimed, and believe it or not, they claimed this well until the 20th century, that slavery, while an unpleasant institution, was nevertheless a humane and decent institution. It's really only in the 20th century that historians took a fresh look at slavery, and an honest look at slavery for the first time, and finally admitted that it was in fact a cruel and dehumanizing practice. And when in the 20th century did historians take that fresh and honest look? It was the time of the Civil Rights Movement, the 1960s, the 1970s. And so starting then, historians finally admitted that slavery was in fact a cruel and dehumanizing practice. All right, a little bit of background on the spread of slavery. In the late 1700s, slavery was actually a dying institution economically. Throughout the South, planters were switching away from crops like tobacco and switching to crops like corn and wheat. Now think back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about colonial Virginia. What do we know about tobacco and labor? Tobacco is very, very labor intensive to grow, and so it lent itself to the institution of slavery. But the crops that were beginning to replace tobacco were not nearly as labor intensive. Corn and wheat And so you didn't really need slavery anymore. And so slavery was beginning to outlive itself and losing its economic benefits in the late 1700s. Only in very confined areas of the South was slavery still thriving in the late 1700s. One area where slavery was still thriving was coastal South Carolina, where the crop is rice, a very labor-intensive crop, and so slavery was certainly thriving there. In the late 1700s, almost no cotton was being grown in the South because cotton was not profitable. The problem with cotton is that there were so many little cotton seeds in the fibers, and it took forever to pluck them out one by hand, that growing cotton was not profitable, even with slave labor. Well, what changed all that? In 1793, a Connecticut Yankee came along named Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney invented this little device that quickly and easily removed the seeds from the cotton fibers. And that device is called the cotton gin. Just like that, the cotton gin made growing cotton with slave labor profitable, and cotton production spread across the South. You know, one day Eli Whitney gave a ball of cotton to his cat, and the cat started to play with it, and you know what cats do with their claws. And as the cat pulled the cotton fibers apart, the seeds started to drop out. And Eli Whitney saw that, and his jaw dropped, and he said, "Oh my gosh, that's it. I'm going to invent a machine that does that." And so here's a cotton gin, and you can see it has those sharp claws in there that pulls the cotton fibers apart and the seeds drop out. And by the way, in the name cotton gin, gin is just short for engine, cotton engine. But what the cotton gin did was to revive the institution of slavery, and it spread across the South all the way to Texas. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves producing 5 million bales of cotton every year. Now, where did all the slaves come from that are filling up these new Deep South cotton states? The slaves are not coming from Africa, because the international slave trade into the U.S. was closed down in the year 1808. No new African slaves entering the U.S. after 1808, at least not legally. And so where are the slaves coming from that are filling up these cotton states? They're coming from the Upper South, Virginia and Maryland. In the Upper South, you can't grow cotton. It's not warm enough. And so Virginia and Maryland continued to switch out of tobacco into corn and wheat, which meant a surplus of slaves. They were selling their surplus slaves into the Deep South to work on cotton plantations. So here's a map that shows the domestic slave trade, and you can see the sale in slaves is moving from the Upper South into the Lower South. If you've ever been heard of the expression, "You've been sold down the river," today that expression means you've been betrayed. But the origin of that expression is in the 19th century, and it referred to slaves from the Upper South being sold down the river, down the Ohio and Mississippi River, into the Lower South to work on cotton plantations. Students tend to think of the South as a uniform land of huge cotton plantations. That is actually not a very accurate picture of the South. So consider this map. The areas of dark orange on the map are areas of big plantations, lots of slaves, and cash crops. But the crop isn't always cotton. In Virginia and Maryland, they're still growing a lot of tobacco, although they're starting to move out of it. In coastal South Carolina, the crop is rice. The cotton belt goes down through southern Georgia, southern Alabama, Mississippi, and into Louisiana. Although when you get to Louisiana, the main cash crop there is sugarcane. And then you can see a couple little pockets in Kentucky and Tennessee, and there the main cash crop was hemp. Yes, marijuana is a form of hemp. Some of the planters did grow marijuana on a very small-scale experimental basis, and they did smoke it to get high. But the hemp that they were growing commercially as their cash crop in Kentucky and Tennessee was a different kind of hemp. They were growing it because it's a fiber that is used to make rope. Okay. Here's cotton in bloom and a cotton field. Looks like it snowed, but that's actually cotton in bloom. Here are slaves hoeing rice in South Carolina and the rice crop. Here are enslaved people harvesting sugar cane in Louisiana and the sugar cane crop. And I couldn't find a good picture of hemp, so I just went with marijuana here. Well, that's half the South. Cash crops, big plantations, lots of slaves. Then there's the other half of the South, so let's go back to the map. So the areas of yellow and clear on the map are areas with very few slaves. It's mostly poor white subsistence farmers. And why are they poor white subsistence farmers? Because transportation improvements have not penetrated into their neighborhoods, and so they have not entered the commercial market economy. And so they're subsistence farmers. And if you notice that area of yellow and clear that goes through western Virginia, western North Carolina, Tennessee, western Georgia, northern Alabama, think about what geographic feature runs right through there. That's the Appalachian Mountains. So this is the upcountry, hillbilly, poor white, redneck South, not cash crops, not many slaves, mostly poor white subsistence farmers. Contrary to popular belief, cotton was not the South's #1 product. The South's #1 product was corn. The South's #2 product was pork. But cotton was the South's #1 cash crop. The corn and the pork were mostly produced for subsistence purposes, to feed the poor whites and the slaves themselves. Corn and pork were raised for subsistence. Cotton was raised to sell. Just a couple statistics. 3/4 of Southern whites did not own slaves. Only 1/4 of Southern whites did own slaves, and so slavery was a luxury for wealthy whites. That means the typical Southern farm either had no slaves or just a small handful. The typical Southern farm was a poor white farm with few or no slaves. But since some plantation had literally hundreds or even thousands of slaves, the typical slave lived on a huge plantation. And so, in other words, the slaves of the South were concentrated on a relatively few large plantations. So most whites don't own slaves. Most slaves live on big plantations.